Hello, and welcome to this special joint podcast by Legal Week and Smith & Williamson. My name is Paul Hodkinson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Legal Week, and I'm here with Giles Murphy, who is the Head of Professional Practices and Head of Business Interests at Smith & Williamson. And we're going to be delving into an analysis of the top 50 UK law firms' LLP accounts. Now, Giles, we spoke about a year ago when you did the same analysis for the previous year, and back then you warned that the balance sheets of many law firms were not in the best shape. They were waiting a long time to be paid, and they didn't have much cash available should any crisis hit. I think we can agree a crisis has now arrived, and so I'm wondering how law firms seem to be measuring up and how well prepared they are for it. What did you see in your analysis? How are law firms doing in general? And how are the biggest firms faring? And what kind of position are they in?
Well, as you say, Paul, this is an analysis of the top 50 law firms' accounts. And the benefits that we really get from doing this are really twofold. First of all, you get access to information that has been independently verified because all of these accounts have been audited by an external party, but also the information is prepared in a consistent format, and therefore it is possible to make some direct comparisons between firms. I think it's fair to say that over the last few years where we've been doing this work, we have seen consistent levels of increases in revenue. So based upon that instinctive KPI number, it looks like the market for the legal practices is fairly healthy.
And what do you mean by healthy? So fee income has gone up, is that right? And profits have gone up?
Yeah, so in the year just ended that we're looking at, so this is through to March, April 2019, revenue on average for the top 50 firms rose by around 7.3%, which compared to 8% in the previous year, which I think in most sectors, most industries would be considered to be quite a positive sign. I think the challenge is beneath some of those numbers. The scenario is perhaps not quite as rosy as those headline numbers might suggest. Now,
the difference between the largest firms and the smallest firms, I see from your analysis, is showing that the fee income gap is the largest it has ever been, I think. So the largest firms, like the Magic Circle law firms, they are getting bigger and bigger. At the bottom end, at the sort of the between 35, 40 and 50 on the table, the growth doesn't seem to be quite as large. What can we take from that? Is that significant that the larger firms are growing faster? I mean, this doesn't include Slaughter and May, does it, because they're not an LLP, but all the other firms it includes, and even international ones, the UK element of their partnerships, it shows that they're growing really well.
Yes, you're right to just highlight Slaughter and May aren't included here because they still operate as a general partnership and therefore aren't required to produce or publish their financial results. But in relation to the others, and clearly these are generalisations, but it does show that the growth amongst the Magic Circle does outstrip other firms. Now, what could be the reasons for that? I think it's fair to say that whenever you take an average number, you're going to include some of the more extreme examples there. And of course, there will be some firms who have models that perhaps are more counter-cyclical, those that focus more on, shall we say, the restructuring market, insolvency market or litigation markets. Clearly, their revenue cycles may well go through different sort of flows than some other firms who are perhaps more ordinarily focused on sort of business, general corporate work and private client work. Another factor, of course, that we do reflect on, and indeed has been commented on a lot in the press, is the squeezed middle. I think there are a number of firms within the top 50 that could fall within this definition. And what we mean by the squeezed middle is really that section of the marketplace that operates in a highly competitive place. One of the real challenges, I think, for firms in this squeeze middle is how you differentiate yourself from your competitors. And the reason why this is so important is that ultimately it's these distinguishing factors, which are the reasons why clients come and use your services. So it is really important for these firms to set themselves apart from the competition.
And are these firms in general getting more profitable? What's happening with their profit margins?
Yeah, as I said earlier, so the 7.3% increase in fee revenue sounds very positive, and it's fair to say that that does flow through to profits. Actually, operating profit for these firms, it was up 7.2% compared to 8.1% the previous year. So as firms grow larger, their profit base grows larger. But underlying all of this is this question regarding whether firms are becoming more productive. And to get a sense of how productive they are, or effectively how efficient they are, one of the statistics to look at is the operating profit margin. The operating profit margin is a way of assessing how much each pound of revenue within a firm gets converted into profits. It's a measure of efficiency, the productivity of the firm. Interestingly enough, for the last period that we're looking at here, that actually fell by 1%, which suggests that firms, while growing their overall revenue, are actually becoming slightly less efficient. This does actually seem to be counterintuitive, because this was at a time when we know firms are investing a lot of money and effort into their brand development, to business development, developing their people, and not least the amount of money that they're putting through in technology. One would expect that with all this investment, firm would actually become more efficient as a result of all this. But actually, as I say, over the last 12 months, we're actually seeing a decline in efficiency.
Is there a big reason for that? Is there a particular thing that is affecting their profit margin? Could it be the staff costs going up again?
Well, staff costs actually appear to be relatively well controlled within this period. So the average cost per employee rose 2.8% compared to the previous year, where it was up at 4.1%. I think probably this is a reflection on just the competitive level of the market. So while fee income has grown, the reality is firms are having to do a lot of extra work to earn that amount. And that is simply as a result of the competitive pricing that exists in the marketplace.
Now, I think for the last few years, you have been pointing out that were some cataclysmic events to occur, that a lot of law firms might struggle to pay their bills, might struggle to pay their staff and their rent and just their general operating expenses. Maybe people didn't listen then because there wasn't a big event, but now there really is with the impact of the pandemic across the world. So what state are firms in that kind of way of thinking? For example, how much cash do they have on their balance sheet? How much debt do they have? Is that improved? Has that got worse? What's the status there?
Yes, it's fair to say that actually the position has improved over the last 12 months. Cash levels across the top 50 firms have increased by just under 15%, which is a positive move, and clearly is an increase greater than the revenue level. So firms are in a better position than they were in terms of the level of cash reserve they've got. However, I do wonder whether the period to March and April 2019 will be seen as the last of the really benign trading periods that law firms have operated through. Clearly, you mentioned the pandemic, but actually, of course, before that, we've seen Brexit have an impact, certainly on some firms, and it's been fairly widely reported that a number of firms felt a slowdown in the autumn of this year, this financial year, as certain transactions, real estate transactions, etc., were put on hold pending some certainty regarding Brexit. To add to that, of course, in the autumn, just before Christmas, we had the general election, which, while clearly was a strong majority for Boris Johnson's government, we've only got to reflect that prior to that, there were significant concerns about what type of government would lead us through this period. And then, of course, unbeknown to all of us, and we're not claiming for one moment that we had predicted a cataclysmic event, but we have all been blindsided by the speed and depth of impact that the pandemic has had. Now, for a lot of firms, that will have hit either a few weeks or a month or so before their year end. So it may not have had a dramatic impact on the financial results for the year ending March 19 and 20. But of course, we're now in the position where we're expecting an extended impact of this, and it may well be the subsequent year where the impact's really felt on that.
Yeah. So the increase in cash is interesting. How did firms do that? Is it possible to tell from the balance sheet? Did they do capital calls? Did they hold back distributions? Did they take on more debt?
It's. I wouldn't say there's any general theme coming through from what we can see. I think it is probably slightly better just cash management. If we look at the sort of debtor days position, how quickly do firms convert the invoices they've raised into cash? That improved slightly. But by 1.4%, but a still fairly derisory level of it still takes on average 119 days. So I don't get the sense it's from dramatic improvement in lockup management. It is more, I think, from just careful payment of suppliers and, of course, partner distributions, which may well have been deferred slightly in this period.
Yeah, the debtor days is a point you've made before, because law firms seem to be quite generous in the UK, don't they, with their clients? They allow them to take a long time to pay, which is quite different to the US, where there's a bigger focus on getting in the cash more quickly. How big a problem do you think that is for the UK industry?
Yeah, I think if we were living in benign, predictable times, then you could argue that it's not of a concern, because there's enough cash flowing in to pay out the necessary suppliers. It's worth reflecting that while the position has improved, for the top 50 firms, the total amount of cash that's held is just shy of 700 million, which does compare to the monthly wage bill of around 650 million. So firms do actually at their period end have enough to pay the next month's wages, but a relatively small shock, for example, as a result of clients paying later in a pandemic environment, could clearly knock that out of sync. And only 1 month's worth of wages, I would suggest, is insufficient. Why are debtor days so high in the UK? It is clearly a structural issue that exists within firms. It has been this way for some time, and firms seem to be, I wouldn't say reluctant, but they seem to be challenged to actually try and improve this situation. And if I had one hope of silver lining coming out of the pandemic, is that going forwards, firms will be much tighter on their credit control, because there is a vast amount of cash resources that are available there if only firms could get better at managing it.
Absolutely. And with the staff costs that you mentioned again, they've been going up for years, haven't they? So I would have thought that there's no real hope, even though there might be a temporary blip now, there's no real hope that staff costs are going to level out for the long term. It's always going to be going up. It's still going to be more salary wars.
Yeah. As I said, I referred to the investment that we're hearing firms making in technology. Why are firms investing so much in technology? Well, clearly, part of it is risk management. Part of it will be providing a better service to the clients. But ultimately, it's so that they can provide a more cost-effective service, essentially rely less upon people and automate some of those processes. That doesn't appear to be coming through in the numbers. The numbers of people employed by firms continues to go up, and the cost of these people continue to go up, albeit slightly lower than in previous years, but still sort of at an amount that's higher than general inflation.
And do law firms have any other big liabilities? So they've got their bank loans and overdrafts. How big are those in comparison to the revenues of these top firms when compared with other sectors, for example? And do they have other problems like pensions deficits to deal with?
Yeah, I think the phrase that we would use to describe the structure of a law firm's balance sheet is that it's thinly capitalised. And what we mean by that is that there's relatively little cash that's left within the business. Any cash that comes in is obviously used to pay suppliers and or partner distributions relatively promptly. Of course, there are some firms who, out of principle, decide not to take on any debt on the firm's balance sheet. One of the consequences of that is essentially partners have to put more money in to fund the business, either in the form of capital or in actually receiving their distributions slightly later. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a consequence of that principle. Whereas, of course, there are other firms who do actually rely upon debt to fund their business. And we would always say that if you've got a long-term debt requirement, you would do that through bank loans, whereas we do see some firms who seem to have almost permanent overdrafts. And of course, the idea of an overdraft is that you just dip into it every now and then when required, whereas I say some firms seem to use it almost like a permanent source of funding. And the risk with an overdraft is that it will be technically repayable on demand, whereas most firms who use overdrafts would not be in a position to do that.
And so with all these things taken into account, then, what would your assessment of the state of the legal industry be? Would you say that the top 50 firms are in a precarious position or in a strong position, or is it more mixed or more nuanced than that?
Well, I think it's still a phenomenal sector, and it's a phenomenal success story for sort of UK PLC. The top 50 law firms generate revenue of over 18.6 billion in the period that we're looking at, which is a vast sector for just the top 50 firms. Clearly, there are some firms within that who are performing extremely well and are structured very comfortably, very prudently. So you need to be careful about making generalizations. I think the concern we have, though, is that in a predictable, positive, economically productive environment, these firms will only carry on flourishing. The concern is that for the period, probably for 3, 4, 5 years up to the year ends in 2019, were, when we look back, actually very benign trading periods. And one has to question whether the efficiency drives, the productivity drives that firms have essentially failed to achieve, and the failures to bring down their lockup will come back to haunt them in the last 12 months. And we'll obviously see that as results come out. But with the triple whammy of Brexit, general election and pandemic, it's hard to see there is going to be a firm out there that's not been affected in some way. And clearly there are some who are more precarious than others.
And just as a theoretical question, but suppose you were called into a firm tomorrow who said, look, Giles, we're really struggling here. We're not sure we can stay afloat. What would be the kind of things you would advise? What are the things law firms really need to focus on to survive right now?
Yeah, sadly, it's not just a theoretical conversation at the moment. We've had conversations with a number of firms, a range of sizes, who are concerned that there's been a tail off of bluntly chargeable value over the last 6 to 8 weeks as the pandemic hit, and that is having a reducing impact on the amount they can bill, and at the same time they do have a cost base to service. Most of them are producing some sort of cash flow projections, and at the moment, with the government support schemes in place, most of them, I think, are in a position whereby they can keep going for a good few months or so. I think the concern is that a number of the government support schemes, particularly in relation to taxation, are deferrals, and therefore these liabilities have to be settled at some point. And we know that 31st of January is the point at which most firms hit their sort of cash lowest point of the year when they make partner tax payments. And we have concerns about 31st of January 2021 and the period up to that, as to whether that's the period that firms will realise that actually they simply do not have enough cash to survive that period. Prior to that, I think the other aspect we're looking at and helping firms with is just the risk of what you might call a run on a firm. And clearly in these uncertain times, the stronger firms will be seen as a safe haven. Those more precarious firms do run the risk that a number of partners might decide that actually now's the time to make the jump while they still can. As we all know, if you're a firm that maybe is not in a particularly strong position and you start to lose a number of partners, a professional practice is actually an environment that can spiral downwards relatively quickly. Now, we haven't seen a huge amount of that yet. Maybe it's too early on that front, but that would be my principal concern, and that would be my advice for anyone in a management team, is to really make sure you know where your partners are thinking. You make sure that you're conscious of how you can lock them in, whether that's legally or through other metrics, because I think the firms that can stay together are more likely to be the stronger ones and be able to see through any difficult trading periods.
Yeah, indeed. And are there any other things that we should all be aware of with these accounts that you've noticed? Other trends or other factors that are interesting?
What I think is the obvious one to reflect on, it is, I'm afraid, something that I do keep going back to, is the level of outstanding bills that exist within law firms. Revenue for the top 50 firms for this period was over £18 billion, but at their year end, there was just under £6 billion sitting on their balance sheet as outstanding invoices. And that is a staggering sum of money, whichever way you look at it. If only law firms could convert just some of these bills into cash, it would put them in a remarkably different position. Not only would it protect the downside, the obvious risk of, obviously firms going insolvent, but actually it would be far more positively put to good use in the firm, in allowing firms some flexibility to invest in their operations going forwards, whether that's people, technology, or indeed acquisitions of other firms. The ability to access that funding would make a massive difference on how they can plan.
Indeed. Well, it's so interesting. Thank you, Giles, for your analysis there. It'd be really interesting to see where things stand in a year's time, given how things are going. And this episode, I think, will be featured on the Smith & Williamson The Pulse podcast, which you can find at the smithandwilliamson.com website and also on Legal Week's website, law.com international. So thank you for listening. Thank you for that, Giles, and all the links and references spoken about will be found in the notes as well. Thank you so much.
This S&W The Pulse podcast is of a general nature and is not a substitute for professional advice. No responsibility can be accepted for the consequences of any action taken or refrained from as a result of what is said. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the presenter or of Smith & Williamson or any of its affiliates. No reproduction of this podcast may be made in whole or in part for professional or recreational purposes. No action should be taken based on this podcast, and we accept no liability if we change your views on any of the subjects mentioned. Smith & Williamson LLP, regulated by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales for a range of investment business activities, a member of Nexia International.